Hey everyone. Today I thought I'd offer a few more thoughts on metamodern Christianity and developmentally informed notions of a Christian faith and sort of I don't know, educational pedagogical catechism or something like that we could imagine as helping to facilitate sort of optimal spiritual growth in metamodern, or should I say, towards a kind of metamodern Christianity for people as they grow and learn and develop through the life cycle, which is sort of the way that I conceive of the spiritual journey, which is not something that you get set from the beginning and then sort of live out in sort of perpetuity, but it's an unfolding, developmental, sort of progressively deepening kind of spiritual journey, and to take that evolving nature of spirituality very seriously and to try to find a way of relating that unfolding message to, yeah, sort of the natural cycles of the lifespan, is I think something that a metamodern spirituality would very much be about, and it's a way of thinking about the different forms or phases or modalities of Christianity that can be comprehensively folded into something kind of holistic and harmonious and comprehensive and integrated. And so, yeah, I thought I would lay out some ideas here, or a sort of ideal vision of what this kind of process could look like. Some of which will be maybe very rudimentary and obvious. Other parts of it might be, I don't know, maybe radical even, or disturbing, depending on what people are familiar with. But uh, but here goes. So when I think about kind of the cycles or the stages that the faith journey unfolds through, well, for one, there are many folks who have been studying these sorts of things at kind of the developmental psychology level for some time, and specifically at the religious development level. People like James Fowler, for example, in his work of Stages of Faith. And for what I'm going to get into here, it's both very influenced by kind of integral philosophy, but also things like the Bildung movement, right, which is sort of like the developmentally appropriate unfolding of learning and knowledge through time, as sort of, yeah, sort of sequentially, successively fitting for people at whatever stage they are in their own sort of developmental progression. And in this sense, there aren't really like, how would you say, like fixed, established, totally kind of given sequences of stages here. Obviously, development is a fluid, continuous thing that has sort of a punctuated equilibrium to it, in the sense of there can be these long periods of sort of like being in a particular phase and then sort of relatively rapid growth to a new phase. But obviously, always it is not like a just sequential ladder, but there's always this sort of dynamic and continuous unfolding. And so I would just also throw that in, that this is just one idea of thinking about the lifespan, and sort of informed by developmental psychology, but there are no fixed, separate, clearly distinguishable stages in any kind of concrete sense, just sort of like heuristics, I guess you could say, for different modalities that mark the developmental process. So here I'll lay out, I don't know, I think I've got like four or five or something like that, beginning from basically birth to early adulthood, which is sort of a, let's say, 25-year period in which the faith journey can unfold and deepen as people learn and they grow in their understanding, and their comprehension of reality increases, and they are able to cognize greater and greater complexity about the world, and to integrate greater and greater levels of differentiation about their experience. Um, so the first stage, you could say, or phase, or what have you, is sort of uh, the kind of childhood phase, like let's say birth to 7 years old. Um, and at this phase, um, the I think optimal relationship to say the Bible and to the Christian message is largely one that is inculcated in kids, at least that I've seen, right, in sort of a Sunday school experience, a kind of classic Sunday school pedagogy, where there's an emphasis on kind of the childlike stories and the more simplistic and positive aspects of the biblical narrative, Noah's Ark, and things like that. But also like a profound sense of the magic of Christmas. I think when I think back to my own childhood, and when the greatest resonances existed with that kind of enchanted quality of reality that came through a religious worldview. It was definitely these holidays, but specifically Christmas, with its sort of aura of I don't know, of the reverential, the divine, the hymns that we'd sing, and the music, and the Christmas tree, and all the ritual that was sort of a part of that, created this very rich sense of just an enchanted world. And I think that that sense of enchantment is really, really important for this sort of first 7 years of life, and the 7 years or so relationship to the Christian message at that age. And, our culture has developed other kinds of ways of mediating the kind of Christian story to kids in a developmentally appropriate way. I mean, I grew up with things like Veggie Tales, and Salty, and children's Bibles and whatnot. And I think our culture has a decent sense of that moment of the sort of moment of childhood, and what kinds of things can be communicated. James Fowler would call this stage of faith the intuitive projective stage, which is like things are very projective in the sense of there's a lot of assimilation going on. There's a lot of sort of magical thinking. It's a very non-critical, naive, innocent mode, where you're basically just drinking in the tradition and learning it from your own kind of rather limited perspective, but in a very sort of enchanted way. Uh, Brian McLaren talks about this stage of faith as what he calls the simplicity stage of just, again, just kind of naive, open, receptive, and also, finding no issue with paradox, or at this point, which can't even really be cognized, but let's say contradiction or doubt or any of that, because you're just beginning to learn the world around you, and whether things, behave in sort of a naturalistic way, or there's supernatural miracles, what have you. Everything's sort of a magical reality, and you're picking up on that. And so I guess I would say that all that should be cultivated and nourished at this stage. It's like a very healthy and important thing for this developmental period to be very much about that kind of enchantment. And again, I don't think that this is, anything that our culture struggles with too much conceptually, in the sense that, you know, even families that aren't particularly religious are very keen to sort of, work with the Santa stories and things like that at this age, as something that can bring a level of enchantment and magic into childhood. Those sorts of things that you look back on later in life with a kind of very rich nostalgia. This period is so important for that, and for laying sort of this really solid foundation of comfort and security, and a sense of depth that is lying in a kind of aura of mystery or something. And so being attentive to that and cultivating that, I think, would be an important part of sort of a, a, a journey through the Christian spiritual life, that aims ultimately towards a metamodern form of Christianity, but certainly not yet. I mean, this is there's a time and a place, right? There's a for everything there's a season, and there's a season for a very simplistic and naive moment in the faith journey, and this is that moment. The second stage or phase is what happens a little bit after this. So, maybe around 7 to 10, and kids go through a really interesting developmental spurt at this period. Piaget talked about this sort of movement from pre-operational into concrete operational thinking. But however you want to conceptualize it, there's definitely a developmental sort of movement that takes place around this time, and kids start to become more more aware, more self-aware, more critical, more kind of reflective in a certain way, and they become more internally cognizant of themselves and their own feelings and their own ideas, and they become very curious, and they become sort of sieves for information, and yeah, and this moment is then very kind of ripe for, I think, a different kind of faith to be activated in people. And I think this is where a lot of people might find, again, around 7 to 10, a lot to be gained from just reading the Bible stories, and the getting a bigger sense of what these legends and tales and myths are about, but also reading, the Gospels and that sort of a thing. And getting a sense of sort of maybe that broader sacred history, um, not in any really intense way to suggest that like a 10-year-old should be reading the entirety of the Bible, and actually I would say developmentally shouldn't be. But again, just certain expansion of scope that goes on, where there's also going to be greater interest and enthusiasm about sort of digesting more of these tales that will kind of take on a new life. I mean, when I was around this age, I got really into knights and castles and the medieval world and all this stuff. There's a kind of fascination with, I don't know, legends and lore and stories and fables, and all that thing, that kind of perspective can really be very vivid, and the imagination really kind of catches fire. And there's a lot in the sort of biblical canon that can speak to that developmental moment in a very kind of vivid way. And I think that what's interesting about this, and here's maybe an instance of some of that kind of radical aspect coming out of maybe what I would suggest here, is that this is the time when something like a fundamentalist or a literalist flavor of Christianity makes a lot of developmental sense. Fowler calls this stage the mythic literal stage, or let's say that at this age range that I'm describing, I think that the mythic literal stage is sort of the developmentally appropriate one, most kind of optimal, makes the most sense. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that what we think of as the kind of literalist approach, or fundamentalist approach, even if you want to call it that, is actually entirely developmentally appropriate at a particular moment in the sort of unfolding of the learning process, and that actually shouldn't be necessarily discouraged. It should be allowed to take place and unfold as a moment in the kind of sequence of the progression of a deepening faith journey. Um, this way of thinking only becomes pathological or problematic if it winds up kind of carrying on into adulthood in a way that sort of stymies development, or leads to a kind of arrested development in religious thought. And unfortunately, that is what we tend to see when we talk about literalisms and fundamentalisms in the world, is sort of this kind of mythic literal approach to religion being sort of extended sort of past its proper moment in the lifespan. But at this age, that's sort of fitting. And so, yeah, I think that there's something that we can do justice to and honor to, of that mode, that way of thinking, that way of reading the Bible and the stories as being true, literally true, physically true, historically true. That there's something, and a kind of almost I don't know, kind of expert grade memorization, and the desire to kind of like digest and metabolize the entirety of these texts and kind of hold them in yourself, and somehow begin to fashion your identity through them. Um, all that stuff that tends to characterize certain forms of fundamentalist literalism can be really helpful for that early moment in ego development and psychological formation that occurs around this age range, 7 to 10. And this might also be a time when something like, if one's part of a tradition where there's chosen baptism rather than like baptism at birth. This could be like a really important moment for that to take place, as there's this coming online of the ego and the sense of identity and individuality of the person who's sort of making a very kind of passionate and kind of invested commitment to this particular set of stories and narratives that they've become very serious about. Um, However, I mean, once you then move beyond this, right, from say like 10 to 13, and you start to get into puberty and you start to move towards, the development of, again, what Piaget would call like formal operational thought and greater abstract thinking, you get the ability to move beyond some of that more simplistic literal reading of stories and the symbols, and you can begin to gain a greater appreciation for symbolism, for metaphor, and for all the kind of interesting variations and nuances of meaning. All this stuff starts to come online, in this important developmental period, 12, 13, 14, somewhere around there, right? And I think this is the beginning really of a kind of, this is sort of the onset of a new, a very rich new mode of spirituality. McLaren calls this complexity. The move from simplicity to complexity is this mode that he marks in his four-stage kind of model of faith. But here's where, things start to become more sophisticated, a bit more rich, more nuanced. Things don't just have a single, simple, literal meaning. Things didn't just happen in a particular way. You have to interpret them. You've got to think about the significance, and you've got to kind of weigh what's going on in these different stories. And it takes a little bit more from you. There's more pieces, more variables, more factors involved. And so there's greater complexity in that sense. And so there's this move from kind of a mythic literalism to what Fowler calls the synthetic conventional stage of faith, which is a more developed form of relating to these stories that takes their abstraction more seriously. Whereas like reading the Bible in a mythic literal sense, and you get the image of, say, the hand of God, that might be a very literal hand of God that is related to. Whereas in the synthetic conventional, the hand of God starts to take on the sense of a metaphor or a symbol of connoting the power and the majesty and the kind of reach of the divine. And even God, as an idea begins to be more immaterial and more abstract, conceptualized, more universal even. And there's a sort of deepening of that conception, and all this can happen within the Christian tradition, and certainly does for many people around this age or at other ages in life. But I think that this age of around 12, 13 or so is where this really starts to set in cognitively and developmentally in a very real way, if the conditions allow for that. And again, if there were a sort of catechism or a kind of pedagogy of a kind of Bildung informed teaching that could help Christians move through these different phases, very natural phases of the spiritual journey, that this could be facilitated much more easily. As it is, some people will struggle actually to make that move from the mythic literal to this mode of more abstract, more metaphorical interpretations. Certain reading communities and traditional devotional contexts will basically set kinds of limits around interpretive modes that are sort of sanctioned, and those that are kind of forbidden or off limits or are deemed wrong. And often this begins at this sort of juncture where the more abstract, the more metaphorical the interpretation starts to become, the more uncomfortable the mythic literal mind is, and we'll kind of try to, like clamp down on its sense of a more simplistic reading. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people's spiritual journeys can be stymied by the particular sort of interpretive community that they're a part of, which can really lead to some arrested development in their faith journey. And this can have, of course, really profound and unfortunate consequences down the line, because eventually, for a lot of people, the development does catch up with them, and then at that point, maybe there's a profound rupture, and they just decide to turn their back on the religious Christian community entirely and say, well, that's all nonsense and fake stories for kids, and now I believe in abstractions and more conceptual, rational ways of thinking about things. And so, unfortunately, that desire to kind of hold people into a more mythic literal frame can be precisely what causes people to reject religion entirely later on, when eventually things reach a breaking point. And I guess I would just say that that certainly doesn't have to be the case, if we were smarter and more adaptive in the ways that we were creating religious containers for people, and developmentally informed religious containers for people to grow into, rather than try to sort of set a particular limit or mold that they have to finish, and then otherwise will ostracize them. So I think a metamodern spirituality, as I'll say in more depth in a moment, is really all about appreciating these growth trajectories and trying to account for them, anticipate them, and build them into the pedagogy of sort of like religious catechism from the outset, as being a way to optimally foster the religious development of Christians. Um, so from here, these ways of thinking and interpreting deepen still and become even more complex and more reflective. So around 13 to 15 in that age group, now people can actually start learning about the history of, say, the pre-modern and the modern, and start to understand some of the historical context for interpretations themselves. I mean, when I got to high school, I had an excellent history teacher who really opened my eyes to, yeah, the different worldviews and perspectives and different kind of structures that have operated throughout history. And at this age, a lot of that can be very elucidating and illuminating, 13, 14, 15, sophomore, freshman, sophomore, junior years. That sort of period where people are starting to think much more on their own, for themselves, and to be able to appreciate change and evolution, and the sense of different accounts of things being given in different contexts. And at this point, that growing complexity is able to account for all those things. There's enough experience and learning that's occurred at this point to have a basis for understanding that sort of a thing. That it's not this sort of like absurd confusion, this notion that, some things worked in this way in this context and other things worked in this way in this context, and maybe there's some relationship in how they unfolded one to the other, etc. This is the sort of thinking that begins to come online at this age, and applied to the Christian spiritual journey is, I think, a really important developmental move. Fowler calls this stage the individual reflective stage, which is basically what it sounds like. It becomes a very individualized, more personal relationship to questions of ultimate concern and meaning and the divine, and it's very reflective. It's asking a lot of questions. It's thinking a lot, and it's critiquing even. It's allowing itself to doubt and to turn inward, and to really consider implications and what's come before, and whether or not everything that has come before should be retained, what's right, what's wrong. It's a mode of thought that is open to wrestling with truth. And so because of that, around this period, around this phase, people become they open to grappling with confusion and to paradox and to different differences in beliefs and opinions. And of course, obviously through experience, especially in our kind of pluralistic world, by this point people will have met people from different religions and different parts of Christianity, and they'll know that they don't all agree. And yet, what do we make of doctrinal differences, and what the church says about this group versus this group, or what about people outside the church? All these things start to become questions and issues that one is reflective upon, and this can go in many different directions ultimately. But if you build this into that sense of the natural trajectory of the Christian faith journey, you can anticipate this and recognize it as an important moment in the individuation process of the person, of the ego, um, of the soul, and as people grapple and think, and become okay with uncertainty, and doubt, but also maybe understand and appreciate or get an inkling of the sense of the importance for certain kinds of naive faith, or certain kinds of practices that are meaningful to them, or certain memories. All that stuff starts to just swell in this kind of maelstrom of developmental churning that goes on in this period, and is very natural, and it's very important as a developmental stage. I mean, all of these stages are hypothetically ones in which people can stay in indefinitely, but they do have a kind of progressive quality that is sort of like moving one to the next as well. That there is something unfolding through these different perspectives, and so there is a kind of what would you say, a kind of energy or a momentum to this. And so this particular one at this age is maybe more unsettled, but it's unsettled towards a kind of move towards greater resolution as well. And in that sense, I think can be deeply appreciated as an important part of a process of the developing Christian journey. Um, so just two more I've got in mind here. And again, you can splice these any number of ways, but these make a lot of sense to me. After this, which I've put around 13, 15 years old, let's say there's the 15 to 18 year range of the faith journey. And, this is going to be end of high school, beginning of college, this sort of like developmental pivot where you're kind of entering adulthood. Your rational faculties are pretty developed at this point, and you've probably taken, some, you know, deeper level math classes and maybe some physics and chemistry and that sort of a thing. You've gotten a taste of the scientific method, and you've been reading, literature, hopefully in, English class and that sort of a thing, and getting a more rounded sense of the human condition, and yeah, again, kind of the rational faculties that have gone into the change in knowledge and understanding over the years. And hopefully also as part of that education, history has become more illumined. So people have a real sense of the relationship between, pre-modern forms of belief and history on into the modern scientific revolution. Maybe at this point, people have sort of abandoned the idea that miracles happen or that there are supernatural phenomena, or maybe they make certain allowances for that in some way that they're able to kind of make sense of, within some kind of naturalistic frame, or some kind of, again, complicated, sophisticated, rational, but also maybe non-para trans rational frame, however you want to describe it. But still, there's all these variables and factors going into trying to integrate, the insights of science and rationality, and also relating to a deeper movement through the faith life as well. Of course, also during this period, people are maturing physically and sexually as well, and exploring, other aspects of the life cycle, and a deepening psychological egoic shifts, level of shifts are happening, beyond just the level of kind of religious thought. And all of those things are informing decision making and knowledge and the learning process. And again, maybe deepening some of the confusion, some of the uncertainty, some of the doubt, but also really enriching and deepening the rational, sort of evidentiary based forms of thinking that have moved beyond maybe simplistic doctrinal or dogmatic affirmations or commitments, and are fully engaged now with kind of the full range of faculties of the mind to be able to weigh different forms of thought, different kinds of evidence, different ways of knowing, etc. So then from here, you get the, let's say, 18 to 23-year-old phase. And this is kind of the college years, I guess, in the West. But here, I would posit that discussions about the significance and the meaning and the reality of postmodern notions becomes well, this is like the developmental moment where that makes sense. It's it because it requires an understanding of, modern science and those kinds of frameworks, and of course because modern science in some ways depends grappling with the whole developmental trajectory, including with pre-modern notions. This is really the first time in life when you have enough of that kind of basic knowledge to be able to contextualize what would even be meant by moving beyond the modern and into postmodern thought. Now, again, like this is an ideal way of presenting this because in the real world, um, kids are just presented with postmodern thought all the time, everywhere on television, et cetera, in a kind of way that can be, I think, sort of developmentally jarring, and the results of this are very intriguing and lead to some really interesting repercussions. I grew up watching, a lot of postmodern television and became very ironized as a kid. And in fact, this was something that even Kierkegaard was observing happening through media already in the late 19th century. That the way that mass media tends to work to propagate certain kinds of ideas that leads to the promulgation of ironic sensibilities and that sort of a thing is something that sort of in the history of ideas makes sense from the developmental trajectory of modernity into postmodernity, which requires a whole set of faculties to understand all those materials in order to then be able to properly contextualize the postmodern. Whereas in today's world, we don't have any of that proper sort of setup before people are just sort of thrust into postmodern thought. And that can be very jarring and confusing to a lot of people, and it can lead to sort of quick, reactionary takes and just sort of like, simple rejections and negations and say this is no good without kind of fully having the materials and the faculties required to understand what those ideas are really about and what they're actually responding to. So in an ideal context, if that were really a Bildung inspired, developmentally informed approach to knowledge, and in this case to sort of religious and spiritual development, it would only be around 18 plus where you start to be developmentally, ready to go conceptually, cognitively, and materially to approach those issues and to dig into them at the right time. And so I would just say all that in the sense that at this point, you're now able to appreciate, hopefully, given enough complexity, that there are systems of justification that we inhabit, and that knowledge is contextualized within cultural milieus, and that we are socialized into forms of belief and knowing and culture and ritual, and that we are products of these cultural contexts and ways of knowing and belief. That are beyond us and that we then reproduce. Um, and so that there's a realization that comes at this stage where we live in these different worldviews. Um, and a lot of that is entirely dependent just on history, on where you live and where you happen to be born, what family you grew into, or were born into, and these maybe more simplistic notions that used to be held to of explaining people's lot in life by how hard they worked or whether or not they were a believer or what have you, don't really seem to pan out when you consider the broader scope of things, which is that there are these enduring systems through time that are very hard to change, that people find themselves a part of and didn't choose, and yet are sort of passive recipients of in some way, and in some ways sort of unconsciously acting out and acting through. Um, and when there's this realization, this leads to a great sense of relativism, right? Of a sense of, wow, I could have been born into a different story, a different religion. I could have been a different race, and then how would that have impacted my lot in life and the privileges that I've had and the accesses to resources and all these things. All of this should be the sorts of things that people are beginning to explore and grapple with at this age. And all of this applies to the spiritual journey as well, right? I mean, what do you take from the notion that had you been born in India, you probably would have been, Hindu? What do you make of the notion that the very idea of being a quote unquote Hindu is actually a social construct that's the product of European colonialism and these sort of enduring power hegemonic systems that have unfolded through history, et cetera, et cetera. What do you make of the notion that even thinking about religion as you do is the product of the dominance of Protestant theology in conceptualizing the very notion of religion as being predominantly about belief? And how has that marginalized other forms of religiosity and belief? On and on and on and on. These are the ideas that, when appropriately developmentally grappled with, start to produce a new perspective on the spiritual journey, and one that again can be profoundly relativizing, and on the positive end, hopefully foster and cultivate a sense of pluralism and a kind of multi-perspectival sensitivity, that there is a profound sense of differences and diversity in the ways of viewing the world. A lot of those are not within your control, and that therefore, what we make of absolute truth and claims to ultimate reality have to be profoundly qualified and attenuated in light of that incredibly contingent nature of truth. Already, just talking about all these things, I'm having to use a bunch of big words, and and I'm not sure if everyone's can be following this, but that's the point of it, is that these are ideas that start to be developed in academia and critical theory and sort of more self-reflective forms of academic engagement, post-colonial thought, and all these sorts of things, that begins to foreground knowledge creation itself and becomes to be sort of self-reflexively aware of the kinds of institutional and systemic structures that serve to frame belief itself. Um, and all that is actually incredibly important for the Christian spiritual journey to take very seriously. And again, there can be a profound sense, especially if people have grown up in those contexts for whom mythic literalism was sort of the normative be all end all approach. By the time you're grappling with the prospects of a postmodern religiosity, you're in some rough waters indeed. That's a hard, tense relationship to navigate those two different perspectives, and can lead to a lot of breakdown, confusion, talking past one another, and tensions. And at the same time, there's a sense in which this is very necessary for being able to move beyond one's parochial thinking, and move beyond the sense that one had the absolute truth from the get-go, and one's community was right and always has been right, and one's been part of a particular tribe that always had, the right answer. Things aren't so certain. They're not so clear. And you could call this, a very kind of advanced form of that individual reflective, or I believe Fowler talks about the conjunctive faith, which I'll speak more about in a second. McLaren talks about this move from we've gone through simplicity to complexity. Here's where the perplexity would show up, of just the sense of relativism, pluralism, um, doubt, confusion. What do you make of truth? What is truth? Is there truth? Isn't truth a construct? Isn't truth a product of language? Et cetera, et cetera. And so this period of these collegiate years, let's say, or the 1823, that period, this should be the time when people are really grappling with these things and deepening their understanding, deepening their knowledge, deepening their familiarity with other traditions, other religions, other ways of knowing, other worldviews, and getting a very rich sense for the tapestry and the diversity of perspectives and beliefs in the world, and hopefully leading to a sense that, well, this is a profound differentiation of the ways of understanding the world, for sure. And that can be unsettling. It can lead to a sense that there is no truth. It can lead to uh, grappling with the idea of nihilism, that all this stuff is just human, all too human, made up. It's sort of a sad farce that people try to look for meaning in life or what have you. There are all sorts of ways that this can go. And again, if we built an expectation of this moment of the faith journey into our spiritual catechism and pedagogy, it's a lot less likely that people would fall into those abysses and those voids and have to grapple with nihilism in the ways that so often people do, because it would be folded into part of the journey, and that when people were having these thoughts and these experiences and these doubts and questions, they could come to elders in their church and their community, and they could ask these questions, and they could say, "Ah, yes, yes, that happens at that point, and you're doing it right. You're asking the right questions. You're learning the right things. Keep probing, keep asking, keep questioning." But again, if instead people start to explore these domains and meet more kind of mythic literalism or just a kind of synthetic conventionalism that can't deal with this kind of perplexity, it's very likely that they'll get shut down and either then have a couple of recourses either to nihilism, outright rejection of the faith, which seems like it no longer can support their individual growth, or giving up on intellectual learning and the deepening of the cognitive developmental process, and just sort of embracing a regressive reactionary response, and sort of throwing their hat into something more classically mythic literal in orientation. And of course, none of those outcomes are ideal. Um, Largely because the stage after this is something very special and important, and what I want to make the case for is being very much about what metamodern Christianity is about. And here I think we're talking around, you're moving beyond the 18 to 23-year-old phase. This is, say, 23 to 27 and beyond ish, right? Early adulthood in the contemporary modern West. Um, Obviously, these ages are from that perspective, but these developmental moments aren't linked to specific ages per se. They could unfold at different specific ages for different people and in different cultures and what have you. So the age isn't really what's important. It's more what the developmental moment is about. But for this context, and also based largely just kind of on my experience of where, based on what I think I was more or less ready or not ready for at different moments in my life, this is sort of the period that I would identify with this move beyond that kind of perplexity and that grappling with the postmodern confusion. So around 23, 27, now you can begin to contextualize all of this. um, you know, you've gained a sense of the history and the pre-modern religion and modern science, and now you've gained a sense of postmodern thought and relativism and social constructivism and the linguistic turn and all this stuff. And you've grappled with the complexity and the truth and the questions of truth and what does it all mean. But you've also appreciated from a very lived and embodied sense that that perplexity isn't sustainable either, right? You can't live forever in that, and there does need to be a kind of solid ground from which one orients and operates from. One can't live as though everything is potentially the truth or that everything is a potential ultimate value. And so there is, I think, organically a movement towards a stabilization around a new kind of center, which is a loosely held center. It's a skeptically informed center, but it is a center. And there's an appreciation that there can be a sense of order and even hierarchy to all these ideas, in a way that isn't inherently bad or oppressive, but actually is the very means by which we're able to live optimally in the world and to orient ourselves towards our goals and our values. And one very profoundly meaningful, important way that this can be done is through the self-conscious realization of this all as a kind of developmental process that's been unfolding. To look back on one's own journey, to look back on history and to see how learning unfolds and to see how one thing does lead to the next and open up new things and expand one's horizons and differentiate information and then integrate into new structures and so on and so forth. And to begin to identify the sort of dialectical patterns at work in the accumulation of knowledge and experience and how that all plays into the faith journey. And at this point, there's been the grappling with the perplexity, the confusion. There's been maybe a dark night of the soul, but there's a kind of coming home and a kind of ability to find an uncertain place of rest or continuity or a kind of navel of the world would be Eliada's phrase, but a kind of basis for a world, even one, albeit that isn't a fixed world. It's one that recognizes it's always a world under construction. It's always sort of the best guest, the sort of best thing possible, but always self-consciously aware that it too can be and probably will be, hopefully will be deconstructed in turn, broken open, and expanded towards something even bigger. But because of that enduring process that seems to have been the continual, reliable pattern unfolding through all of these worldview transformations, there's a continuity and a stability also at work, and a kind of appreciation for the deep patterns and the structures that seem to be at play in the unfolding of knowledge and learning and understanding and wisdom accumulation amidst all of the change and transformation and uncertainty. McLaren calls this harmony, having moved now from simplicity to complexity to perplexity to harmony, is where these things, all of the diversity, all the differences somehow work together, right? Like different notes in a chord, they all are part of something that is sort of greater than the sum of its parts and work together into something very beautiful and symphonic and mellifluous that without any of these individual parts wouldn't be possible. I mentioned Fowler calls this the conjunctive form of faith, which is, again, conjunctive. It's the sense of things coming together, but being comfortable with the paradox of how they come together, of not everything fully maybe has its answer or is fully clarified. There are horizons of uncertainty, and there's also, I think, the certainty of uncertainty, that there will always be that, and the becoming comfortable with that. And this can be experienced as a profound sense of relief and, again, sort of a coming home, a sense of things clicking. I've mentioned a couple of times Kierkegaard talking about a second immediacy, right? In his stage model, right? You go from sort of unreflective, naive immediacy to a reflection or reflective thought to then this regaining of a second immediacy. There's this sense that you've moved through reflection and you've somehow found your way back to something that has the air of naivete about it, even though it's inflected with reflection. Paul Ricoeur talked about the second naivete. In metamodern thought, this is ironic sincerity and pragmatic idealism and informed naivete. Informed naivete, because you've been through the reflection and the perplexity, but you've landed back in a place where you're able also to embrace the simplicity and the naivete and the innocence of something after, on the other side of all of that. Yeah, this is a kind of sensibility. It's a kind of way of being in the world that's open. It's developmentally informed, it's loose, it's diverse, it's pluralistic in outlook, but it's also coordinated. It's an integrated pluralism that brings together all the differences and the differentiated aspects of different forms of consciousness and different kinds of belief into something that's like a symphony where all those parts work together. And this, I think, is really what I imagine to be the essence of a meta-modern Christianity, a Christianity that's on the other side of the postmodern perplexity and has landed in this meta-modern harmony and this informed naivete that's able to relate to the different parts of the spiritual journey as being each one important in its way, in its time, in its moment, um, but also then realizing that each one in its moment, in its way, misses something from that perspective of the harmonious whole. So there's a way of both honoring where one has been in all these different movements along the way, honoring the traditional and the modern and the postmodern, but also realizing how all of those in their own way miss something or leave something out, or at the very least, all need to work in concert with each other to produce this kind of synergistic new thing, which is this new kind of spirituality. Um, so when I think about metamodern spirituality, that's kind of the modality that I'm imagining. And so one of the concerns then would be, um, is that modality that we're seeing unfolding around us in culture right now, is it taking seriously the modern moment, the reflective moment? Is it taking seriously the postmodern moment and the kind of perplexity? Is it all traditional devotional or is it no traditional devotional, right? How much of all of these different things are really being incorporated and integrated into this? Which of these perspectives can actually adequately be toggled through? And how will people know when and why they should toggle to one perspective versus the other in a particular context? And there are certain kind of criteria, I think, or sort of that's too formal, but certain kinds of tells or signs, I think, that are indicative of whether or not this is operating effectively or not, which is what perspectives are being left out, which ones are being sidelined or repressed, even which ones are being mocked and derided and we don't want anything to do with that, or which ones are being said, oh, that's from the devil or what have you. um, because a metamodern harmonious conjunctive sort of faith would be one in which all of those have something to contribute. And so, a big thing that I'm just trying to do in my own way in this moment, in this conversation, is to just make sure that all those moments of that developmental faith journey are given their due. There's clearly folks who have a deep awareness and passion and sensitivity to the traditional lens, and there's certainly a lot of that people can draw on and are familiar with. And that also makes sense too, given where people come from. It's in some ways easier to gain access to those moments of the faith journey, such as the intuitive projective and the mythic literal, because a lot of people have been through those phases already. Whether or not they've moved then into the modern, perspective that then grapples with the reflection, with the history, with the science, with the issues of naturalism and questioning, the means and the causal forces behind things. That's a different question. Have they grappled with the history? Have they grappled with the historical critical studies? That's a big thing I'm trying to bring in so much because that's something I'm very familiar with and has been very influential in my own faith journey. And it seems to be not as much engaged by other people in the space. So just really wanting to speak to that. But also the postmodern. Are we comfortable with relativism? Are we using relativism, though, just to support a kind of mythic traditionalism? Or are we deeply appreciating the reality and the challenge of relativism and the pluralism that comes with the postmodern frame? Also, a really important question. So, as this conversation continues to unfold, there will be different perspectives and different emphases that people will be bringing into the space. For my part, I'll continue to keep doing what I'm trying to do, which is emphasize the modern and the postmodern in addition to the traditional, so that we get as much as possible a fully rounded, comprehensive, complete integration of these different modes and lenses, because you need all of them to be able to do this harmonious symphonic movement, I believe. So that's my take on this. The last thing I guess I'll say is that obviously this isn't the end. Um, uh, Fowler has a final stage, which he calls the universalizing moment of faith, and it's related to the sorts of faith that the great sages, exhibited. But history moves on and development unfolds, and in this sort of catechism that I gave, it only goes up to 27, and I'm a deep believer in lifelong learning and growth and development. So, what does it mean to be 35 and a Christian, or 40, or 50, 60, 70, 80, or beyond? What additional moments become possible, new insights, and how do we fold those in to a comprehensive vision of the Christian faith journey? It seems to me to be the big question. And so we shouldn't presume that any of this currently has the final say, because things continue to evolve and change and grow and deepen, and I find that a very beautiful way of looking at the whole thing. Some of this may sound, again, familiar, obvious even. There's a certain element in which this is already things that churches do in terms of, preaching the message to kids and young adults and that sort of a thing. But on the other hand, I think there is something a bit more radical to it, especially when we have to grapple with the fact that maybe this is really indeed an ongoing process that we're all invited to partake in. And maybe challenging as it is, maybe we're called to doubt, to question, to grapple with that complexity and with that perplexity. Maybe those are necessary moments to get us closer to harmony. And I just will continually invite people to think in those terms, because I think very much there's the default mode of assumption that if someone doubts, it is a falling away from the faith journey. When I see it as just the opposite, as the occasion to deepen and to expand one's understanding of the divine and the sacred and what it's all about in a way that, yeah, breaks down those old barriers and destroys those old idols that were forcing us to work with a more narrow and limited conception of ultimate reality. And for me, the faith journey is about coming to see through more and more of reality, and to take more of that into ourselves and to relate to it in a deeper way. Because isn't that what the sacred calls us to? Isn't that what God is, as ultimate reality? And so the more we're able to try on different lenses, explore our own perspectives, and see all of our own blind spots as best we can, the more we're able to see God for what God is and not what we are projecting God to be or creating God to be, would be one way of framing it. And for me, that's very much what the Christian journey is about, as well as the spiritual journey more broadly. But I'll leave it there. Hopefully, that fills in a few more bits of information and gives a bit more of the gestalt of what I'm working with when I think about a metamodern Christianity. And of course, the ways in which all of this dovetails with the actual unfolding of the historical progressive revelation through time, and the way that the evolution of the Bible and the stories themselves unfolded is a fascinating thing, which I won't get into with this video, but we'll be exploring in deeper videos and in my or in further videos and in my book as well. But I'll leave that here for now. Thanks, everyone. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear if this resonated with you. If you had any hangups or issues, problems, questions, concerns, and maybe I'll make some kind of a response video to this and some of the other things I've done on this topic recently. All right, take care.